Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. I never gave much thought to my neighbor, at least not beyond the usual polite greetings and the occasional small talk as we passed by each other. His name was Tom, a reserved man in his early 60s, with graying hair that curled slightly at the ends and a tendency to keep to himself. He had moved in about a year ago, taking over the small house next door after the previous owners retired to Florida. We exchanged nods at the mailbox, the occasional good morning when I was out watering my plants, but nothing deeper than that. He seemed like the type of man who valued his solitude, and I wasn't one to intrude. Besides, my own life was busy enough. At 6, I was adjusting to a new phase of life, living alone after my children had moved out, navigating the silence that had once felt unbearable in a house that had once been full of life. Then came that evening, the night everything changed. It had been one of those exhausting days where even the smallest tasks felt like climbing a mountain. The grocery bags were heavier than usual. The traffic had been unbearable, and an unexpected downpour had left me soaked by the time I reached my doorstep. As I struggled to find my keys with my hands full, I heard a voice behind me. "Need a hand?" I turned, startled. It was Tom, standing just a few feet away, dressed casually in a navy sweater and jeans, holding an umbrella. He must have seen me struggling from his porch. I hesitated. I wasn't used to asking for help, but the weight of the day pressed down on me, and I found myself nodding. "Actually, yes, thank you." He stepped forward easily, taking the heavier bags from my arms and following me inside. The warmth of the house was a sharp contrast to the dampness outside, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," I said, brushing wet strands of hair from my face. "I know," he replied simply, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "But I wanted to." There was something about the way he said it, genuine, unforced, not out of obligation, but out of choice. We stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between us. I had never really looked at him before, not properly. There was a kindness in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before, a quiet steadiness. "I should probably get out of your way," he said after a beat, glancing toward the door. "Wait," I said, surprising even myself. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can do." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'd like that." And just like that, Tom, the man who had always been just a neighbor, became something more. We sat at my small kitchen table, the sound of rain tapping against the window as I poured 2 cups of coffee. The conversation flowed more easily than I expected. He told me about his late wife, how he had moved to this neighborhood for a fresh start. I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years, about my kids, the loneliness that had crept into my days, the strange transition from being a mother, always needed, to a woman trying to rediscover who she was. "It's strange, isn't it?" I mused, staring into my coffee. "Spending so much of your life taking care of others, and then one day, you realize you don't even know what to do with yourself." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it is." For the first time in a long while, I felt understood. Hours passed without notice. When Tom finally stood to leave, I walked him to the door, a warmth settling in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thank you," I said again. This time, not just for carrying my groceries, but for something deeper. He held my gaze for a moment before nodding. "Anytime." And with that, he was gone, stepping back into the night, leaving me standing there, my heart beating a little differently than before. That was the night everything started to change. The days that followed felt different. Every time I stepped outside, I found myself glancing toward Tom's house, half hoping to catch a glimpse of him. I told myself it was just the novelty of a new neighbor, someone who had shown me an unexpected kindness. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something about the way he listened, the way he made me feel like I mattered in a world that often seemed too busy to notice. It wasn't long before I saw him again. It was a Saturday morning, and I had just stepped out to grab the mail when I noticed him in his front yard, adjusting something on the small garden fence. He looked over at me and waved, And I smiled back, my heart fluttering in a way I couldn't quite explain. "Good morning," he called out, his voice warm and familiar. "Morning," I replied, walking toward him. The sound of my slippers against the pavement was the only noise between us. We fell into easy conversation again, discussing the weather, his garden, my plans for the day. But this time it felt different, more personal. There was a subtle tension in the air, a magnetic pull that neither of us acknowledged, but both seemed to feel. I noticed how his eyes lingered on me as I spoke, how his smile lasted just a little longer than usual. "Actually," he said, as though coming to a sudden decision, "I was wondering if you'd like to join me for a walk tomorrow. It's supposed to be nice, and I thought it might be a good chance to get to know each other better." I was taken aback by the invitation. It was simple, unassuming, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. I had been so focused on my own world for so long, lost in my own thoughts, trying to avoid the quiet that threatened to swallow me whole. But now the thought of sharing time with Tom felt like a lifeline. "I'd like that," I said before I could stop myself, a smile spreading across my face, a little too eagerly. He grinned, and for a moment I saw something in his expression, a spark, perhaps. That night I couldn't stop thinking about him. The past several months had been spent in isolation, avoiding the emptiness of my thoughts. But now the idea of spending time with Tom felt like a doorway opening to something new. It wasn't just the companionship I craved, it was the feeling of being seen again, of sharing space with someone who wasn't looking at me like I was just another neighbor, or a woman in her 50s trying to figure things out. The next day, I found myself standing at the front door, waiting for Tom to arrive. When he finally did, looking effortlessly casual in a navy jacket and jeans, my heart skipped a beat. There was something about him that made everything else fade into the background. "You ready?" he asked, his eyes lighting up with a hint of excitement. I nodded, feeling an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, something I couldn't quite explain. We walked in comfortable silence at first, the gentle crunch of gravel beneath our feet the only sound between us. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the street as we passed the familiar sights of our neighborhood. But with Tom beside me, even the most mundane things seemed new, as though I were seeing everything for the first time. "So, tell me more about you," he said after a while, his voice steady and calm. "You mentioned you have kids." I nodded, glancing at him before focusing ahead. "I do. 2 grown kids, actually. Both of them live out of state now." "I see," he replied, his tone thoughtful. "That must be hard." It was more than just the physical distance. It was the way they had grown, changed, become people who no longer needed me in the way they once had. But I didn't want to burden him with that, not yet. "It's different," I said, a soft laugh escaping my lips. "But I'm adjusting." He nodded as if he understood. There was a pause, and then he said something that caught me off guard. "I think I know what you mean," he said softly, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "After my wife passed, I had to learn how to be alone again. It's not easy, you know." I glanced at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. Tom, who had always seemed like the strong, silent type, was sharing something deeply personal. "I didn't know that," I admitted, my heart aching. "I'm sorry to hear that." He gave a small smile, but there was sadness in his eyes. "It's okay. We all have our stories, don't we? It's just part of life, I suppose." There was a weight to his words, and for a moment, everything around us seemed to fade. It was as if the world had paused, giving us this rare, fleeting moment of connection. In the stillness, I felt a new bond forming between us, one born of shared experience and mutual understanding. We continued walking, the conversation flowing naturally. Now we talked about our lives, our losses, and the little things that made us smile. I learned that Tom had a deep love for old films, and I told him about my love for gardening. By the time we reached the park, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. We stopped at a bench, and for the first time in ages, I felt truly at peace. There was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet comfort of being in someone's presence, without the need to fill the silence. "This is nice," I said, settling onto the bench, looking up at the stars. "Yeah," he agreed, sitting beside me. "It is." We sat there for a while, neither of us speaking, but the unspoken connection between us was undeniable. As the evening drew to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. It wasn't just the walk, it was everything that had come with it. The way we had opened up to each other, the way I felt understood in a way I hadn't in years. When Tom walked me back to my door, he turned to me with a soft smile. "I'm glad we did this. We should do it again sometime." "I'd like that," I said, my heart racing, as I looked up at him. And with that, he was gone. But something had changed, something deep within me that I couldn't quite articulate. It was as if, in that moment, I had found a piece of myself I hadn't realized was missing. The following week felt like a blur. My thoughts often wandered back to that walk with Tom. The easy conversations, the gentle laughter, the unspoken bond that it formed between us. It was something I hadn't expected, and yet it felt so natural. Every time I saw him outside, tending to his garden, or standing by his front door, my heart would flutter just a little. There was a connection growing between us, something that neither of us had anticipated, but both seemed to be quietly nurturing. One afternoon, after a particularly busy morning, I found myself standing on my front porch, staring out at the neighborhood. It had been a long day, and the quiet of the house pressed in on me, reminding me of how alone I often felt. I had just about convinced myself to head inside when I saw Tom walking towards me, a small package in his hand. "Hey, neighbor," he called with that familiar, warm smile. "Tom," I said, feeling a mix of surprise and excitement. "What's this?" He held up the package. "I found something I thought you might like. It's a little something for your garden." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued for my garden. He nodded, handing it to me. "I've been working on some plant cuttings and thought you might appreciate this one." I took the package, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a small potted plant, its leaves vibrant and green. It was a species I'd admired for years, but never gotten around to the planting. My heart swelled at the thoughtful gesture. "This is beautiful, Tom. Thank you," I said, touched by the unexpected kindness. He shrugged, looking almost bashful. "It's nothing. I just thought it would be nice to add something new to your garden." I smiled at him, my gratitude overflowing. "I don't know what to say. You've already done so much for me." He tilted his head slightly. "I haven't done anything that anyone wouldn't do for a friend." His words struck me in a way I hadn't expected. He had referred to me as a friend, and it felt like a turning point. We had moved beyond the simple exchanges of neighbors. There was a depth to our connection now that made everything else seem insignificant. That evening, after planting the new addition to my garden, I found myself standing outside, staring at the small plant, as if it held some kind of significance beyond its physical form. It was a symbol, a reminder that things were changing. Over the next few weeks, we spent more time together. We went on more walks, shared coffee on quiet mornings, and found ourselves talking about everything and nothing all at once. There was something undeniably comforting about Tom's presence, like he had always been a part of my life, even though I had only truly gotten to know him recently. One evening, as we sat together on my porch, the sun sitting behind us, the conversation took a more serious turn. Tom looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You know, it's strange," he said quietly. "I never expected to find someone like you here, someone who understands." I felt the lump form in my throat. The way he said it with such vulnerability made something shift in my chest. We had always been so comfortable around each other, but now there was an intimacy in his words that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I never expected it either," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I've ever felt this way connected to someone in such a long time." Tom's eyes softened as he looked at me. "I feel the same. It's like I've been living in this quiet, empty space for so long, and now you're here, and it feels like something has woken up." The air between us seemed to thicken, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The unspoken words hung in the space between us like a tangible thing. My heart pounded in my chest, and yet I didn't feel afraid. It was as if everything had been built into this moment, and I was finally ready to acknowledge what had been growing between us. Before I could say anything, Calm stood up, his gaze still locked with mine. "I think I should go," he said, his voice steady, but filled with something more, a kind of emotion that lingered in the air. I nodded, though. I didn't want him to leave. "Yeah, it's getting late." As he turns to leave, he hesitated, glancing back at me. "We'll talk more soon." Okay, I'd replied softly, watching him walk away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I sat in my chair staring out into the dimming light, my mind racing. Something had shifted, something unspoken, but deeply felt, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was the beginning of something I hadn't even known. I was ready for that night. As I lay in bed, I'd reflected on everything that had happened. The connection with Tom had grown so naturally, so unexpectedly. What started as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much deeper, something I hadn't dared to hope for. I was beginning to realize that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just existing, I was living. It was the next morning when I received a text from Tom. My heart skipped a beat. As I read it, "I've been thinking, maybe we should spend a little more time together. Just the two of us. I don't know what this is between us, but I feel like it's worth exploring. Let me know what you think." I stared at the screen, my thoughts swirling. It felt like everything had been leading up to this moment, a crossroads where I had to decide if I was willing to take a chance on something new, something unexpected. It was a risk, but wasn't that what life was all about? Taking chances when the opportunity arose. I took a deep breath and typed back, "I've been thinking the same thing. Let's see where this goes." The response was immediate. "Great, I'll see you later. Yes, I'm looking forward to it." The simple exchange left me feeling lighthearted, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much more to discover. This wasn't just about a relationship, it was about rediscovering a part of myself. I hadn't realized I've lost. Later that afternoon, we met at a small cafe in town, one of our usual spots. As soon as I saw Tom walk through the door, I felt that familiar warmth in my chest. But today it was different. There was a certain anticipation in the air, something unspoken but palpable. "Hi," he said softly, taking the seat across from me. There was a hint of nervousness in his eyes that made me smile. "Hi," I replied, my voice a little breathless. I felt it too, the excitement, the uncertainty, the possibility. We ordered our drinks, and the conversation flowed easily, just like it always had. But today, the silence between us felt charged, as if we were both waiting for something to shift. We both seemed to be feeling the weight of the moment, and yet there was no pressure, just two people simply being with each other. At one point, as I stirred my coffee, I found myself looking at Tom, really looking at him. The lines on his face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way his hands moved as he spoke. It was all so familiar, but now it felt different, more intimate, more meaningful. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "I've never felt like this before, not in a long time." "Anyway," Sean looked at me, his gaze soft but intense. "I know what you mean. It's like we've been on this quiet journey together, and now it feels like we're at the beginning of something new." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside me. Everything had changed since that first walk, and as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't deny the connection that had blossomed between us. There was a moment of quiet between us, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes slowly. Tom reached across the table, his hand hovering just inches from mine. I felt a flutter in my chest, a mix of excitement and nervousness. But when he gently placed his hand over mine, I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself feel the warmth of his touch, the calmness that spread through me. "I don't know what this is," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "but I want to find out with you." And that was when I realized that I wanted the same thing. I wanted to discover what was unfolding between us, even if it wasn't entirely clear. As the days turned into weeks, our bond continued to deepen. We spent more time together, shared our hopes, fears, and dreams, and slowly began to carve out a new chapter in our lives. There were moments of uncertainty, yes, but with every shared smile, every small act of kindness, it became clear that we were building something strong, something real. And as I stood in my garden one evening, looking at the plant that Tom had gifted me, I realized that it was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of growth, of new beginnings, and of unexpected connections. I had never imagined that something so simple could bring so much meaning to my life. Tom had shown me that sometimes the most unexpected gestures lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. And through it all, I had learned to embrace the beauty of new beginnings, because sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them with a smile. I looked out at the world ahead, feeling hopeful for the first time in a long while, and I knew that whatever happened next, I wasn't alone.